September 1944, near Bayeux, Normandy. The German field cook stared in disbelief at the British lieutenant standing before him. After 3 days as prisoners, he and his 4 kitchen comrades expected transfer to a distant camp, perhaps hard labour, certainly separation from their unit. Instead, the British officer was pointing at their Gulaschkanone, the wheeled field kitchen German soldiers affectionately called Gulaschkanone, and asking through an interpreter if they could prepare dinner. Not just for themselves, but for everyone. British soldiers, other German prisoners, and even nearby displaced French civilians. "You want us to cook?" the head cook asked, certain he had misunderstood. The concept violated everything Nazi propaganda had prepared them for regarding British barbarism toward prisoners. For 4 years, they'd heard stories of Allied cruelty, starvation rations, and vindictive treatment. Yet here stood this lieutenant, explaining matter-of-factly that his unit had outpaced their own kitchen staff. They were all hungry, and the Germans clearly knew how to operate their equipment. The British 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division had captured this support unit during the push eastward following the successful Normandy landings. Among their regular prisoners, infantrymen, artillerymen, and the occasional officer, they found something unexpected: a complete Heeresverpflegungsamt, Army Provisioning Office, detachment with 5 trained cooks, 3 fully operational field kitchens, and supplies meant to feed a German company for a week. Military records from September 1944 confirm this unusual encounter. The 50th Division's War Diary notes, "Captured German field kitchen with personnel intact, equipment serviceable. Decision made to utilize same for immediate improvement of food situation." This practical approach to enemy resources wasn't specifically outlined in any military handbook, but reflected British pragmatism in the field. The German field kitchen, the Feldkochherd, represented remarkable efficiency in mobile catering. Designed to feed 125 or 150 men from a single unit, these wheeled kitchens could prepare meals while literally on the move. 2 large kettles, each holding 65 litres, could produce soup, stew or coffee for an entire company. German military specifications required these kitchens to begin serving hot food within 30 minutes of setup, efficiency the British Army Catering Corps could seldom match. Unteroffizier Fritz Müller, the senior cook according to POW processing documents, had served as a baker in Frankfurt before the war. His assistant Wilhelm Becker had been a hotel chef in Hamburg. Together with 3 other food service specialists, they had kept their unit fed through the fierce fighting following the Allied invasion. Now, as prisoners, they faced the bizarre prospect of continuing their duties, but for their captors. The German cooks exchanged glances, weighing their options. Refusing might mean separation, standard POW camps, perhaps shipment to Britain or America. Accepting meant maintaining their unit cohesion, continuing their profession, and perhaps better treatment. According to later interviews with Müller, it took less than a minute to decide. "Jawohl," Müller replied, straightening his posture. "We can cook. What supplies do you have?" That simple exchange, documented in both British records and post-war interviews, began one of the war's most unusual arrangements. Within hours, the Gulaschkanone was steaming. German cooks were chopping ingredients, and British soldiers were forming queues with their mess kits, creating a scene that contradicted everything both sides had been told about their enemies. As darkness fell over Normandy that September evening, the aroma of cooking food drew British and German soldiers to a shared meal that neither side had anticipated at dawn. The first hesitant tastes, the cautious appreciation, the surprised nods of approval. These moments began a culinary collaboration that would eventually challenge deeply held prejudices more effectively than any propaganda campaign. That first shared meal revealed profound differences between German and British military culinary traditions. Unteroffizier Müller's team prepared their standard Eintopf, a thick one-pot stew combining potatoes, turnips, barley, and small portions of preserved meat. The British soldiers approached the steaming kettles with visible skepticism. Their own army catering corps typically served separate components: meat, vegetables and potatoes distinctly plated, not mixed together in Germanic efficiency. "It's all together," one British corporal observed, poking his spoon into the thick mixture. The German cook nodded, explaining through halting English and gestures that this maximised nutrition and minimised fuel usage. The British soldiers' confusion deepened when no bread accompanied the meal. German military cooking relied on the dense, dark Kommissbrot, 750-gram loaves that soldiers carried in their packs, not prepared fresh at each meal. British Army records from 1944 documented standard rations at 3,300 calories daily per soldier, including fresh bread delivered daily when possible. German Wehrmacht regulations specified 3,100 calories, but by 1944, actual provisions had declined to approximately 2,600 calories, with heavy emphasis on potatoes and root vegetables. This caloric reality was visible in the contrast between the well-fed British soldiers and their somewhat leaner German prisoners. Most striking to the German cooks was the British obsession with tea. Within hours of establishing the field kitchen, British quartermasters delivered 12 large tins of tea leaves alongside white sugar and powdered milk. According to Ludwig Hahn, the youngest German cook whose post-war memoir documents this arrangement, the British officers insisted on tea being available continuously, not just at mealtimes. "They drink it like water," he wrote, "and become irritable without it." British Army regulations from 1944 confirm a tea ration of 5/8 ounce per man daily, enough for 6 strong cups. The British soldiers, meanwhile, marvelled at how German cooks utilised every available resource. Vegetable trimmings became soup base. Stale bread transformed into thickener. Bones were roasted before boiling for deeper flavour. These techniques reflected years of German resource constraints that had trained military cooks in extreme efficiency. British Army catering corps training, by contrast, emphasised standardisation over improvisation. Cultural misunderstandings abounded. German cooks prepared coffee at dawn, following continental traditions. British soldiers expected tea. The Germans scheduled the main meal at midday. The British expected it in the evening. British officers initially insisted on being served separately from enlisted men, a class distinction that bewildered the Germans, whose officers ate the same food as their men, merely in different locations. By the second week, practical compromises emerged. Mess schedules posted in both languages show how meal timing evolved. Breakfast included both coffee and tea. Lunch became lighter than German tradition, but heartier than British custom. Dinner incorporated elements from both cuisines. British supply sergeants provided unfamiliar ingredients: canned tomatoes, dried fruits, exotic spices from colonial outposts. The German cooks experimented cautiously. "We thought they would be monsters," Müller confided to a German-speaking British lieutenant after 3 weeks of cooking. "We were told you starved prisoners." The lieutenant replied with equal candour, "We thought all Germans were fanatics. Yet here you are, just cooks like our own." Military historian Arnold Kershaw's analysis of British 21st Army Group records confirms that by October 1944, at least 17 similar arrangements had developed across the Allied front, with German POW cooks maintaining their duties under British supervision. The British 50th Division's medical officer noted improved morale in units with German cooking support, attributing it to more regular hot meals and improved variety of preparation methods. What began as an expedient solution to temporary conditions was evolving into something more structured. The professional respect between cooks transcended national uniforms. When a British supply truck delivered unfamiliar ingredients, German and British kitchen staff huddled together, comparing techniques and trading knowledge that neither side's military had anticipated sharing. October 1944, near Eindhoven, Netherlands. The aroma of freshly baked bread, a scent previously unimaginable to troops at the front, wafted across the makeshift British encampment. Inside a requisitioned Dutch schoolhouse, Unteroffizier Müller and his team had constructed 3 improvised ovens from brick rubble, sheet metal, and parts salvaged from their damaged field kitchens. The British 50th Division, advancing through Holland, had brought their German cooking unit with them, an arrangement no military manual had anticipated. "They asked if we could make proper bread," Müller explained to a visiting British officer. "So we built these." The ovens produced 200 loaves daily, combining German baking techniques with British white flour. The dense, nutritious loaves became highly prized among British troops, accustomed to pre-sliced tins of mass-produced bread shipped from England. British supply records from October 1944 show a 40% reduction in shipped bread to units employing German bakers, saving valuable cargo space for ammunition and medical supplies. The improvisation extended beyond bread. When British quartermasters provided unfamiliar ingredients, canned pineapple, dried coconut, American spam, the German cooks experimented cautiously. Ludwig Hahn, the youngest cook, developed particular skill with British tea rations, creating a strong sweet brew that British soldiers lined up to receive. His victory tea, brewed with added condensed milk, a hint of cocoa, and crushed hard candies, became so popular that soldiers from neighbouring units came to trade cigarettes and chocolate for a canteen cup. "We're feeding 300 men 3 meals daily from kitchens designed for 150, recorded British Lieutenant James Harrington in his October field report. The German cooks work 14-hour days without complaint. Their efficiency exceeds our own catering corps. This productivity didn't go unnoticed at higher levels. By November, British Second Army Headquarters had issued a memorandum. German POW cooks may be retained at unit level where security allows and performance merits. The cooking operation expanded beyond military personnel. In villages across the Allied advance, German field kitchens, now painted with British insignia but still operated by their original crews, provided hot meals to displaced civilians. Near Nijmegen, Müller's team fed 120 Dutch civilians daily alongside their British and German military diners. Military government records document this unusual arrangement. German POW catering unit providing daily meals to civilian population under British supervision, reducing demand on civil affairs food supplies. Cultural exchange flowed in both directions. British cooks learned German techniques for extending limited ingredients through careful stock making and preservation. German cooks adopted British meal scheduling and tea service. The resulting hybrid cuisine created something entirely new, a pragmatic wartime fusion. British soldiers taught their German counterparts to prepare custard from powdered eggs and milk. German cooks showed the British how to make dumplings that transformed thin stews into filling meals. The numbers tell the story of expanding operations. British quartermaster records from November 1944 show one German POW kitchen team feeding an average of 275 people daily, using 15% less fuel and 22% less raw ingredients than equivalent British catering units. By December, 17 documented German cooking teams operated under British supervision across the front, serving approximately 4,500 meals daily to British troops, other German POWs, and civilians. Wilhelm Becker, formerly a hotel chef in Hamburg, received permission to maintain a garden behind British lines, growing herbs and vegetables to supplement military rations. His notebook, preserved in Imperial War Museum archives, meticulously records yields: 85 pounds of turnips, 140 pounds of potatoes, 32 pounds of onions, harvested before the first frost. These fresh ingredients transformed standard military fare into something approaching pre-war civilian meals. As winter approached, these cooking arrangements became increasingly formalized. British officers issued handwritten certificates to their German cooks, identifying them as essential personnel. These documents, several of which survive in archives, protected the cooks from transfer to general POW camps. What had begun as emergency improvisation was evolving into something more permanent, a recognition that former enemies could provide essential services under the right conditions. January 1945. Kleve, Germany. The British 21st Army Group's headquarters mess hall, once a German school gymnasium, buzzed with activity as Field Marshal Montgomery's staff officers lined up for their midday meal. Behind the serving tables stood Unteroffizier Müller and his team, now wearing clean white cook's garments with small POW badges sewn discreetly on the sleeves. What had begun as battlefield expediency had evolved into official policy. British War Office Directive 7342, issued December 1944, formalised the status of German POW cooks. German prisoners with culinary training may be employed in field kitchens and base installations where their skills contribute to operational efficiency. The document established payment, 6 pence daily, held in trust until repatriation, required weekly security reviews, and mandated humane treatment in accordance with Geneva Convention standards. This transformation from ad hoc arrangement to official program reflected growing British labour shortages as the war entered its final phases. By February 1945, military records documented 1,263 German POW cooks working across British military operations in northwest Europe. They prepared meals in field hospitals, headquarters installations, transit camps, and forward bases. The largest operation, at the Brussels Transit Hub, employed 41 German cooks feeding 3,200 personnel daily. These weren't merely casual arrangements, they represented systematic British policy utilising enemy skills for Allied benefit. For the German cooks, this work provided privileges unavailable to ordinary prisoners. International Red Cross inspection reports note they received better housing, additional rations, typically 3,800 calories daily compared to standard POW rations of 2,900, and exemption from transfer to distant camps. At Kleve, Müller's team occupied a small house near the kitchen facilities rather than sleeping in general prisoner barracks. They received weekly meal privileges months before other prisoners and earned canteen credits for purchasing personal items. "The cooking saved us," Müller later told British military historian Richard Atkins in a 1957 interview. "Without it, we would have been anonymous prisoners in distant camps. Instead, we maintained our professional identity and dignity." This sentiment appears repeatedly in post-war accounts from German cooks who served under British supervision. The status difference between cooking POWs and regular prisoners created occasional tension. British security reports from March 1945 note incidents where other German prisoners accused the cooks of collaboration. At the Ostend transit facility, regular German POWs initially refused meals prepared by their countrymen. Yet pragmatism typically prevailed. Hunger overcame ideological objections. Within days, the objecting prisoners joined meal queues alongside everyone else. British officers' attitudes toward their German cooks evolved similarly. Initial suspicion gave way to professional appreciation. Captain William Hartford of the Royal Army Service Corps wrote in his February 1945 assessment, "The German cooks demonstrate remarkable professionalism and adaptability. Their kitchen maintains the highest standards of hygiene and efficiency. I would gladly employ these men in peacetime." Such evaluations appear frequently in British military records from this period. As British forces advanced deeper into Germany, the POW cooking program expanded paradoxically. More German military cooks fell into British hands, while growing numbers of displaced German civilians required feeding. British military government established centralised feeding stations in occupied towns, often staffed by German POW cooks under British supervision. In Münster, 6 former Wehrmacht cooks prepared meals for 700 civilian women and children daily by April 1945, using American and British supplied ingredients. International Red Cross inspector Maurice Rossell documented this arrangement during his April 1945 visit to British occupation zones. The employment of German military cooks to feed civilian populations represents a pragmatic and humane approach. These men maintain professional pride while serving their own people under difficult circumstances. His report praised the British approach as superior to practices in other occupation zones. As Germany collapsed in spring 1945, the question of what would happen to these valued POW workers gained urgency. British units that had relied on German cooks for months now faced both victory and the prospect of losing their well-functioning kitchens. The German cooks themselves confronted uncertainty: repatriation to a destroyed homeland or continuation in British service? May 8, 1945. Hamburg, British occupation zone. The radio announcement of Germany's unconditional surrender created an unprecedented situation in the kitchen of the British 7th Armoured Division headquarters. Unteroffizier Müller and his team of German cooks stood motionless, wooden spoons and ladles frozen in mid-air as the news echoed through the converted brewery they had operated for the past 6 weeks. British soldiers erupted in cheers, while the German cooks maintained professional composure, continuing to prepare the evening meal despite the historical weight of the moment. "What happens to us now?" Müller asked the British mess officer later that evening. The question resonated across hundreds of similar arrangements throughout British-controlled territory. The war's end transformed 371,000 German prisoners from enemies to something more ambiguous: defeated nationals awaiting repatriation. Yet the German cooks occupied a unique position in this transition, having become essential to British military operations. Within days, British military authorities issued Directive 9/118 addressing this specific situation. German POW catering personnel may continue their duties during the transition to peace. Repatriation of these specialists shall be prioritised according to operational requirements rather than standard protocols. This bureaucratic language masked a simple reality: the British weren't ready to lose their German cooks. For the victory celebration on May 9th, British commanders requested special meals from their German kitchen staffs, creating profound emotional complexity. At the Hamburg headquarters, Müller's team prepared roasted ham with pineapple, Duchess potatoes, and apple strudel, a meal simultaneously celebrating their own nation's defeat. British soldier Archibald Jenkins recorded in his diary, "Strange watching Jerry cooks prepare our victory dinner. They worked with perfect professionalism, though it must have been bitter. The meal was excellent, perhaps their way of showing dignity in defeat." Across the British occupation zone, German POW cooks continued their duties through summer 1945, their status evolving from prisoners to something approaching civilian employees. Payment systems formalised, with wages deposited into accounts accessible after repatriation. British military government records from August 1945 show 842 German cooks still employed across the occupation zone, serving approximately 210,000 meals daily to British personnel, other POWs, and German civilians in community feeding centres. The decision of whether to request repatriation or continue working created personal dilemmas for the cooks. Wilhelm Becker, the former Hamburg hotel chef who had maintained gardens behind British lines, submitted a formal request to remain in British service. His application, preserved in military government archives, cited the opportunity to practice my profession with adequate resources versus returning to a city without functioning kitchens or reliable food supply. British authorities approved 214 similar requests by September 1945, creating a transitional category of retained enemy personnel distinct from POWs. For those choosing repatriation, British commanding officers frequently provided individual recommendation letters. Captain Thomas Worthington's letter for Ludwig Hahn represents dozens found in archives. "This man has served as a cook under my command since October 1944. His conduct has been exemplary, his skills exceptional. He has earned the respect of British personnel through his professionalism and character. I recommend him for immediate employment in civilian food service upon his return to Germany." Special arrangements marked the departure of long-serving kitchen teams. When Müller's original group from Normandy finally received repatriation orders in October 1945, the British 50th Division organised a formal dinner where British officers served their departing German cooks. Lieutenant Colonel Richards presented each man with a small gift: a set of British measuring spoons, cigarettes, chocolate, and a signed photograph of their British kitchen colleagues. These gestures, documented in multiple unit histories, represented recognition of professional bonds that had transcended enemy status. As trains and trucks carried German cooks back to their hometowns, many carried more than personal possessions. British authorities permitted them to take recipe cards, notebooks of techniques, and small quantities of rare ingredients like tea, spices, and chocolate. These culinary souvenirs, seemingly trivial amid continental devastation, would influence German cooking in unexpected ways during Reconstruction. The final statistics tell a story of gradual transition. By December 1945, British forces employed 378 German cooks. By March 1946, 127. By June, just 42 specialists retained for officers' messes and major headquarters. The rest returned to a Germany where their unusual wartime experience would prove unexpectedly valuable in the challenging years ahead. December 1946, Frankfurt, American occupation zone. The line of hungry Germans stretched around the block, drawn by rumors of a new restaurant offering something extraordinary: unlimited tea served British style with milk and sugar. Inside the converted storefront, Unteroffizier Fritz Müller, now simply Herr Müller, proprietor, moved efficiently behind a counter fashioned from American shipping crates. The teapots, British Army surplus purchased through occupation authorities, steamed constantly as Germans experienced flavors most had forgotten during years of ersatz coffee and herbal substitutes. Müller represented hundreds of former POW cooks who returned to devastated German cities carrying an unexpected asset: intimate knowledge of Allied food systems and techniques. In cities where functioning restaurants were rare and food supplies strictly controlled, these men leveraged their unusual wartime experience into immediate employment. Their British military recommendation letters, bearing official stamps and signatures, opened doors with occupation authorities that remained closed to most Germans. The culinary influence flowed in both directions. In Britain, demobilized soldiers returned home with newfound appreciation for German cooking techniques. The dense, nutritious bread they had enjoyed from POW bakers influenced post-war British baking. Army catering schools incorporated lessons from German field kitchens, particularly methods for stretching ingredients and reducing waste. The British Army Catering Corps' 1947 field manual included sections on continental efficiency measures that clearly derived from German practices. Wilhelm Becker, who had maintained vegetable gardens behind British lines, opened Hamburg's first post-war hotel restaurant in February 1947. His establishment featured a distinctive Anglo-German cuisine, traditional German dishes prepared with British organizational methods and service traditions. Contemporary accounts describe his dining room's unusual feature: an afternoon tea service complete with tiered stands holding small sandwiches and pastries, a direct import from British officers' messes where he had worked for 18 months after the war's end. Most significantly, many former POW cooks became key figures in Germany's hotel and restaurant renaissance during the economic miracle of the 1950s. Ludwig Hahn, whose Victory Tea had once been traded for cigarettes among British soldiers, established Frankfurt's Englischer Hof Hotel in 1951. Its restaurant featured dishes documenting his unique culinary journey: Tommy pudding, made with powdered milk and eggs; Churchill stew, featuring corned beef and root vegetables; invasion bread, using British-style flour and German technique. Statistical records from West German hospitality associations reveal the impact. Approximately 340 hotels and restaurants established between 1947 and 1957 were founded or co-founded by former military cooks with British POW experience. These establishments employed an estimated 4,800 workers and served approximately 12.6 million meals annually by 1957, representing nearly 8% of West Germany's commercial food service sector. The connections formed over shared meals sometimes lasted decades. In 1962, British veterans of the 50th Division organised a reunion in Newcastle that included invitations to 7 German cooks who had fed them during the advance through Europe. 6 attended, travelling from Germany at British expense. photographs show former enemies sharing meals and memories, united by the universal language of food that had first connected them amid war's destruction. Hans Müller, son of the original Unteroffizier Müller, continued his father's culinary legacy by studying at a British hotel school in the 1960s, his tuition partially funded by a scholarship established by British veterans. His subsequent career included positions at London's Savoy and Claridge's before returning to Germany to operate his father's expanded restaurant business. This second-generation connection exemplifies how culinary bonds formed in crisis created lasting professional networks. Modern food historians recognize this wartime culinary exchange as more significant than previously acknowledged. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley of the European Culinary Institute observed in her 2019 analysis, "The integration of German POW cooks into British military kitchens represents one of history's most unusual cultural exchanges. These daily interactions around fundamental human needs, preparing and sharing food, created understanding that formal reconciliation programs could never achieve. The legacy continues in subtle ways. British military dining facilities still serve a dense brown bread, called Wehrmacht loaf, by older personnel. German restaurants near former British bases often feature distinctive tea services. These culinary echoes, spanning decades and generations, began with that surprising moment when British soldiers, recognizing skilled professionals behind enemy uniforms, pragmatically asked their German prisoners to feed everyone. The captured German cooks, initially stunned by the request to prepare meals for their captors, ultimately demonstrated how shared food transcends artificial divisions. Their story reminds us that human connections, formed through the simple act of breaking bread together, often prove more durable than the conflicts that temporarily divide us.